I never thought the sound of a guest room door closing would stir something in me I hadn't felt in decades. But it did. And not because of who was behind it, but because of who I had become. When my husband told me his old friend from high school would be staying with us for a night, I barely looked up from the dishes. I offered the polite smile I'd perfected over the years and nodded, already preparing a mental checklist of fresh towels, guest sheets, and what I'd cook for dinner. Hosting wasn't new. In fact, it was something I used to enjoy, back when it felt like I was being seen for it. But now it felt like clockwork. My name is Helen. I'm 61, married for nearly 37 years. And though I've built a peaceful life with my husband, Robert, somewhere along the way, the light in our home dimmed. We still share coffee in the mornings, still talk about grocery lists and neighbor gossip, still sit on the same couch every evening, but somehow we became outlines, shadows beside each other. Predictable, quiet, comfortable. So when Robert mentioned that his friend, Thomas, would be staying with us while in town for a business conference, I assumed it would be another evening of surface-level small talk and polite smiles. I hadn't seen Thomas in years, maybe 20. I remembered him as the tall, clever boy from their college photos, always smiling, always standing just a bit taller than everyone else. When the doorbell rang that Friday evening, I wiped my hands on my apron, smoothed my hair, and opened the door to a face both familiar and changed. Thomas stood with a leather duffel slung over his shoulder, a weathered look in his eyes that somehow mirrored my own. "Helen," he said with a warmth that felt like it remembered me better than I remembered myself. There was a brief hug, a round of casual greetings, and then dinner. The three of us at the table, the conversation flowing easily at first, old memories, shared jokes, people who'd come and gone. But as the evening wore on and the laughter softened, I began to notice the way Thomas's eyes lingered. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me wonder when I had last felt, noticed. After Robert excused himself to take a work call, Thomas and I remained at the table, a soft silence settling between us. He took a sip of wine and looked around the room. "You've made a beautiful home," he said finally. "Thank you," I replied, surprised at how much those words warmed me. "It feels lived in, real." I gave a small smile. "It is. 30 years in the same house will do that." There was a pause, and then he said something I didn't expect. "You seem different than I remember." I tilted my head. "Different how?" He hesitated. "Quieter, or maybe smaller." I should have been offended. But instead, I sat there, heart pounding lightly, wondering why the comment struck so close to something I hadn't dared to name. It wasn't that he said I seemed smaller. It was that I had felt it too. When I finally stood to clear the plates, my hands were trembling just slightly. I told myself it was the wine, or the years, or the surprise of an unexpected comment. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. It was the realization that someone had looked at me and truly seen me. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. And that night, when I heard the soft click of the guest room door closing down the hall, I laid awake staring at my ceiling. Because I knew something inside me had shifted, and I had no idea what to do with that. The next morning began the way most of my mornings do, early, quiet, and alone. I padded down the stairs, fingers brushing against the railing, passing by the closed guest room door like it was nothing. Like I hadn't lain awake half the night replaying every word, every glance from the evening before. The kitchen was still, the smell of freshly ground coffee my one constant companion. I moved through the motions with practiced ease, boil, pour, wait. But something in me felt altered, like I'd been nudged slightly out of place. Not broken, just shifted. I stood at the window, looking out at my garden. The roses were starting to bloom again. Last week, I was proud of that. Today, I didn't feel much of anything at all. I didn't hear him come in. I always remembered you being a morning person, Thomas said, his voice softer than it had been last night. I turned quickly, almost startled. He was dressed simply, a navy sweater, jeans, barefoot. He looked different in the daylight. Gentler, maybe. Or maybe it was me who was seeing him differently. Some habits never change, I said with a faint smile. Coffee? Only if it's yours. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring in through the east-facing windows, casting long, golden streaks across the wood. Robert was still upstairs, likely checking emails or lost in one of his early meetings. He never liked weekends without something to do. Thomas sipped his coffee and looked around the room again. Still feels like you. That made me laugh, quietly, tightly. I don't know if I feel like me anymore. He didn't say anything right away. Just looked at me with that same searching expression from last night. And somehow, it didn't feel intrusive. It felt steadying. You've always been the grounded one, he said. Even back in college. Everyone admired that about you. I looked down at my hands. They looked older lately. The lines deeper, the skin thinner. But they were still mine. Being grounded feels a lot like being stuck. Sometimes, I whispered. He didn't argue, didn't comfort me, just sat with the truth of that. Robert came downstairs a few minutes later, chipper and unaware. Breakfast was made, conversation lightened. The rest of the day unfolded like any other Saturday. Except it wasn't. Not for me. Every time Thomas smiled across the table, every time our eyes met for a second too long, I felt the pull. Not romantic. Not yet. Just the ache of being seen, recognized, remembered. That afternoon, while Robert was out picking up a part for the lawnmower, Thomas found me in the garden. I was kneeling in the dirt, deadheading the roses, pretending the world hadn't shifted beneath my feet. He crouched beside me. You always loved these, he said. I still do. He reached out and gently touched one of the blooms I hadn't gotten to yet. His fingers brushed mine for just a moment. Just enough. And I looked up at him. Really looked. I didn't say a word. Because I knew that from that moment on, nothing between us would be quite the same. I didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't guilt. Not exactly. It was something quieter. Like the uneasy flutter of a curtain in a still room. Barely there, but impossible to ignore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment in the garden. The way our fingers had touched. The way he looked at me, like I wasn't someone's wife or hostess, but something else entirely. Something I hadn't felt like in a long, long time. The next morning, Thomas was gone before I woke up. Robert mentioned it in passing, barely looking up from his tablet. Tom had an early train, left a note, said thanks. That was it. No mention of last night's dinner. No thanks for the conversation. No goodbye. And yet, all I could feel was the weight of everything unspoken between us. The house felt different after he left. Quieter. Like something had been lifted. Or maybe stolen. I tried to return to my routines. I cleaned the guest room, laundered the sheets, watered the garden. I made lasagna the way Robert liked it, and sat beside him on the couch while he watched a documentary I wasn't really following. Everything looked the same, sounded the same, but I wasn't. That week passed slowly. I found myself glancing at my phone more often, expecting nothing, but hoping anyway. There were no messages. And yet, I carried our garden moment like a secret pressed deep into my chest. One evening, while Robert was out with his cycling group, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat outside. The garden was quiet. A soft breeze moved through the roses, and for a moment it felt like the silence was speaking. I closed my eyes, and then I heard the faint buzz of my phone. One message. Helen, I hope I'm not crossing a line, but I haven't stopped thinking about that moment in your garden. I don't want to complicate your life. I just need you to know. Being near you stirred something in me I didn't realize I'd lost. Thomas. I stared at the message, the words blurring slightly from the heat behind my eyes. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a proposition. It was honest. And somehow that made it even more dangerous. I didn't reply right away. I couldn't. Instead, I turned off the phone and sat there, heart aching, not with fear or regret, but with a quiet, unfamiliar longing. Not for Thomas, but for the version of myself he had briefly brought back to life. The one who smiled without effort, the one who felt warmth spread through her chest from nothing more than being seen. The one who remembered what it meant to feel alive. I didn't respond to Thomas's message for 2 days, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure who I was allowed to be anymore. I stared at those words more times than I could count, reread them while folding laundry, while making dinner, while standing in line at the grocery store. And every time, my heart reacted the same way, with a thud that reminded me I was still very much alive. On the third day, I finally replied. I felt it too. I don't know what it means, but I haven't felt that way in a long time. Helen, no follow-up, no elaboration, just the truth, plain and terrifying. His reply came an hour later. That's enough for me to know I wasn't imagining it. I won't press, Helen. Just know I'm here. Anytime. I tucked my phone away after reading it. My hands trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from the sheer intensity of feeling something real again. The next few weeks settled into a quiet rhythm. Nothing changed on the surface. Robert remained his usual steady self, gentle, predictable, absorbed in his projects and the latest home improvement ideas. We shared meals, errands, moments, but in the spaces between, I was somewhere else. It wasn't about Thomas. Not entirely. It was about me. About the way I began to see the parts of my life I had long stopped noticing. How the bedroom felt colder at night. How the sound of Robert's voice had faded from affection to routine. How I had spent years making sure everything ran smoothly for everyone else, never once asking what I truly needed. One Saturday, while Robert was out at the hardware store, I found myself standing in the guest room doorway again. I hadn't come in since Thomas left. The bed was freshly made. The air still held the faintest trace of his cologne, woodsy, clean, masculine. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there, suspended in memory, in possibility, in fear. And then I reached for my phone. Thomas, are you free for coffee sometime soon? Somewhere quiet. It took him only a minute to respond. Just say when. And that was the moment I crossed a line. Not with him, but with myself. Because I knew once we met again, I could never pretend this was nothing. I could never tuck it back into the shadows and call it harmless. I wasn't chasing romance. I wasn't even sure I was chasing Thomas. I was chasing myself. The version of me I thought had faded years ago. The one who felt deeply, who wanted more, who still believed it wasn't too late to be seen as something more than a fixture in her own life. And for better or worse, I was ready to find her. We met on a Tuesday, late afternoon, when the coffee shop on the edge of town was mostly empty. Just the soft clinking of spoons and the quiet hum of conversations low enough to fade into the wallpaper. I chose the corner table near the window, the one with the faded floral curtain and the chipped paint on the sill. I didn't want a scene. I wanted stillness, privacy. Thomas arrived exactly on time. That didn't surprise me. He always struck me as the type who respected the gravity of small moments. He walked in without scanning the room. He saw me instantly. And when our eyes met, something in my chest folded in on itself. I wasn't nervous. I was aware. Aware of how far I'd come from the woman who only weeks ago was folding guest towels and going through motions. He approached the table, slow and certain, and offered a small smile that felt more like a question than a greeting. "Thank you for coming," I said softly. "Thank you for asking." There wasn't much need for small talk. We both knew why we were there, though neither of us dared to name it out loud. Instead, we talked about everything but the obvious. His flight back home the next day, my garden, how quiet the town seemed compared to when we were all younger. But beneath every word was the tension of what hadn't been said. Finally, after our cups were nearly empty, I broke the silence. "Why did you text me that night?" He didn't flinch. "Because I couldn't pretend it didn't mean something." I looked down at my hands, the way they curled around the cup, like I was holding something precious. "It did," I whispered, "and that scares me." Thomas leaned forward just slightly, not in a rush, not pushing, just being there. "Helen, I know what your life looks like from the outside. I'm not here to pull you away from it. I'm not here to ask for anything at all." "Then why?" He hesitated. "Because sometimes we live so long in silence, we forget what it's like to be heard." Those words broke something inside me. Because they weren't about romance. They weren't about desire. They were about truth. I'd spent so many years managing, smoothing, fixing. And somewhere in all that maintenance of life, I had lost the sound of my own voice. Thomas didn't try to touch me. He didn't lean closer. He simply waited with the patience of someone who understood the cost of hesitation. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said. "You don't have to know. Just don't lie to yourself about what you feel." And for a long time, we sat there without saying another word. The coffee cooled. The light shifted. And something in me softened just enough to allow room for something new. I wasn't in love with him. But I wasn't numb anymore, and that was enough to start unraveling everything I thought I knew about my life. That night, I sat in the living room long after Robert had gone to bed. The house was dark, except for the dim glow of the lamp beside me and the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't avoiding sleep. I was simply existing in the stillness. The conversation with Thomas played on a loop in my head. Not the words exactly, but the feeling. The weight of being listened to without judgment. The gentleness in his eyes when he spoke. The way he never rushed me, never asked for more than I was ready to give. It had been so long since anyone looked at me like I wasn't just part of the furniture of their life. And Robert? He was a good man. He always had been. Loyal. Dependable, the kind of husband you could build a safe, stable life with. But somewhere along the way, the warmth between us had become muted, familiar, silent. We hadn't fought. We hadn't fallen out of love in a dramatic way. We had just drifted, like two boats floating in the same harbor, anchored side by side, but never moving toward each other anymore. And that realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, reading the paper, drinking coffee like always. The scene was so normal, it made my chest ache. I sat down across from him. "There's something I need to say." He looked up slowly. Eyes cautious but kind. "Okay." I didn't tell him about Thomas, not in detail. But I told him the truth, that I had been feeling invisible, that I had felt something stir inside me I didn't expect, that I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew it wasn't this quiet fading. He didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself. He just listened. When I finally stopped talking, the silence between us was heavy. "I didn't know you felt that way," he said softly. "I didn't either," I whispered. "Until I did." He nodded, slowly folding his paper and setting it aside. "I guess we've both gotten comfortable," he said. "Maybe too comfortable." That surprised me. The way he said it. The way he looked at me. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of sad understanding. "Do you still want this?" I asked. "Us?" He didn't answer right away. And that silence, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. It wasn't that he didn't love me. It was that he didn't know how to see me anymore. And in that moment, something inside me let go. Not out of resentment, but out of clarity. Whatever happened next, it had to begin with truth. Not for him, not even for Thomas, but for me. The days that followed were quieter than usual. Not in a heavy way, but in a way that felt like something had settled. Like a stone finally placed where it belonged. Robert and I moved through our routines, still kind to one another, still exchanging words over coffee and the evening news. But the tone had changed. There was a softness now, a gentle space forming between us, not filled with anger or blame, but with truth. We didn't pretend anymore. I spent more time in the garden, pruning, planting, letting the silence of the soil speak to me. I wasn't trying to escape. I was simply listening. A week after that morning in the kitchen, I found myself driving to a place I hadn't planned to go. It was instinct, not intention, that led me to the edge of town, to a familiar little bench near the old walking path by the river. And he was already there. Thomas stood as I approached, his expression unreadable at first. But when he saw my face, something in his posture eased. "You came," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure I would," I replied. "Are you?" "No," I admitted, "but I'm here." We sat in silence for a while. The river flowed steadily beside us, birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the tall grass at our feet. Everything around us moved without urgency. "I didn't come here to start something," I said. "I came here because I needed to finish something inside myself." Thomas nodded. "That makes sense." I looked at him then, really looked, at the way time had settled gently into the lines around his eyes, at the way he didn't rush to fill silence with words. He didn't need to claim anything from me. And that, I realized, was why I had trusted him. "I'm not leaving, Robert," I said. "Not today. Maybe not ever. But I need to start living like I matter again. I need to rediscover the woman who once dreamed of more than routines and grocery lists." "You deserve that," he said, his voice barely above the breeze. "And I needed you to know," I added, "that it wasn't about you. Not really. You just happened to remind me of something I forgot I had inside me." Thomas smiled then, small but real. "Then I'm glad I could do that." We didn't hug. We didn't touch. We just sat there a little longer, watching the river, both of us knowing that whatever this was, whatever it had stirred, had already done its work. By the time I returned home, the sky was turning gold with late afternoon sun. Robert was out back, fixing a loose board on the fence. He looked up as I walked across the yard, and for the first time in a long time, I saw him looking at me, not past me. Maybe we weren't broken. Maybe we'd just stopped being curious about each other. Maybe now we could begin again, not by going backward, but by choosing each other in a new way. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I do know this: I am not invisible. And I am no longer waiting for someone else to give me permission to feel alive. This time, I give it to myself. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write to the bell. And share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.